participants we have 24 participants at the moment for our last evening session, and I can see that at least Jan-Werner Müller is here, Ákos Róna-Tas is here, and I'm sure that Andrew Arato will join us later. These are the three speakers for tonight, and I'm glad to see two of you now with us, and we will start in a minute. We had a very long day, and most of us who participated from relatively early morning, at least in Central European times, we are a little bit tired, but I think many of us are still very excited to see you all here, because this will be a very special event with three experts who live on the other side of the Atlantic, and for them it's not so late, but all of them actually have some Hungarian roots or connections at least, and this is an event which is dedicated to transatlantic relations, and I am glad that in your as individuals, in your personalities, in your stories, in your background, you already share a sort of transatlantic alliance somehow. But that's maybe not the most scientific observation I did in my life. But anyway, it's great to have you here. We have discussed many issues which are related to our current topics, and somehow it's a continuation of our long days discussions we started a couple of hours ago, and we discussed international order, media, also economic issues, climate change, and the role of civil society, and many other issues which are related to politics. So we did not only focus on, let's say, security issues. Now, one issue was already raised before, and including rule of law and populism, where the name of Jan-Werner Müller was already mentioned. So it's not the first time you are somehow present at this conference, Jan, but we already discussed the definition of populism and whether it's good or not. And I know that you are not going to focus exclusively on populism tonight, but still for us living in Hungary, the problem of populism, nativism, nationalism, authoritarianism is maybe the #1 issue, especially during our primaries, which the opposition parties has just started to organize, and it goes very well. I made a sort of introduction at the very beginning, what I will not repeat now, just to inform you who join us a little bit later, that it's really an issue we discuss nowadays in Hungary. What are the chances of the united opposition in Hungary to defeat this populist, nationalist, authoritarian government? Which brings us to your presentation, Jan, and just after you, it will be Ákos and then Andrew, who will discuss similar issues from different perspectives. But your title is, Jan, the critical infrastructure of democracy, which is certainly, I think, very much connected to the threats and risk what liberals and Democrats in general face nowadays. Now, you are professor of politics at the Princeton University. I think most of us know that. And without further introduction, I would like simply give you the floor. You have 10-15 minutes, altogether 30 minutes. That might include questions and answers. So the floor is yours, and after you, the two other presenters will follow you. So you are welcome. Please go ahead, Jan.
Thank you very much, Hege. So if I understood it correctly, the idea is that when the Europeans get tired, the Americans are brought in to say something uplifting, or at least make a couple of jokes. I probably will fail in both regards, because my short intervention here starts with what is a rather negative observation. And it's about the, I think by now we can say, transatlantic ongoing discourse about the crisis of democracy, which I think has been characterized by at least two very unfortunate tendencies. One has been that certain scholars, observers, pundits in this discourse, I think in effect, simply would like to reassert the status quo with, a few policy tweaks here and there, and if possible, a little bit of hand-wringing by liberals about having ignored the left behind, having been too condescending vis-a-vis rural voters, that sort of stuff. And on the other extreme, those who in essence are telling us that our whole existing model of representative democracy is deeply flawed and should be replaced. Scholars, in other words, who've argued that political parties as we know them, even elections as we know them, are inherently inegalitarian, have inherently oligarchic tendencies, and ideally would be replaced by what is sometimes now called lotocracy, which is to say, randomly chosen citizens making decisions in special assemblies or so-called mini publics. Cross-cutting this division has been a slightly but not entirely different one, namely a split between those who, broadly speaking, would like to blame elites in the broadest sense for the current crisis of democracies. And on the other hand, of course, those who would be more inclined to say, no, ultimately it's the people themselves who are at fault, who brought all this upon themselves, who, after all, voted for Brexit, who, after all, opted for Trump, and so on and so forth. This, by the way, I think has been a great chance for a different kind of liberal, essentially to more or less indulge in all the good old cliches from 19th century mass psychology. It's a chance, in a fairly unashamed way to let loose again when it comes to saying that, of course, people are so irrational. Everybody's just waiting for the great demagogue to seduce them. This, as you all know, then easily leads down a path where one ends up saying we need more gatekeepers again, we need more professionalism. The problem is that in a certain way, the people themselves have become too powerful. Now, I think what these last two diagnoses I mentioned, even though they are so obviously different, actually have in common is that ultimately they focus on different groups of people, be it the many or the few. And my suggestion to you is that it would be more constructive in this ongoing debate about what troubles our democracies to basically reorient our gaze away from different groups and towards institutions. And more particularly, those institutions which pretty much since the 19th century had been considered to be absolutely crucial for the functioning of representative democracies. Namely, I'm not telling you anything new, political parties and professional news organizations. This is what I would like to call the critical infrastructure of democracy. As you all know, the word infrastructure has become incredibly popular. Everybody nowadays, is in favor of infrastructure, more infrastructure, repair infrastructure, and so on. But I think in this context, it actually does have a plausible specific meaning. Because when you think about it, both parties and professional news organizations or media on one level are about reaching other people and being reached by them. So similar to, let's say roads, or for that matter, something like the post office. Or if you want to put it differently again, it's essentially the institutions that allow citizens effectively to use their basic communicative freedoms. You all know what the classic ones are: free speech, free assembly, free association. And my suggestion to you is that we might make some headway in thinking about what is troubling democracies today if we got clearer on what exactly we need from this kind of critical infrastructure. There's been a tendency here as well to kind of go from one extreme to the other when it comes to judging the health or state of this kind of infrastructure. Some of us are old enough to remember a time when we were told that Twitter was a liberation technology, that Facebook was going to trigger democratic revolutions everywhere. Now, as you all know, we've ended up in a place where some of our distinguished historian colleagues say things like Facebook equals fascism and the end of democracy. The fact that there's been this wild swing from one side to the other, I think is a very clear indication that A, we lack criteria for making sense of some of these institutions of the critical infrastructure of democracy, and B, and I won't go further into that, but I'm happy to talk about it later if you like, that we suffer, as so often, from the illusion of a previous golden age, when allegedly everything was much better, and it's poor us who are fated to live with new media that supposedly will end democracy as we know it. So all I want to do this evening is to suggest, on a relatively abstract level, two important functions of this critical infrastructure of democracy, and then also three criteria for judging the health, or if you like, the status of that infrastructure. And I hasten to add, all this will be fairly theoretical, fairly abstract, but hopefully we have at least a few minutes to maybe flesh out some of these ideas. And remember that all this is just in the service, and it's a very limited aim in a sense, to kind of reorient our gaze away from immediate policy questions, away from blaming either the people or elites, towards a more fine-grained engagement with the still indispensable institutions for representative democracies. Okay, so very quickly, two functions that remain indispensable when we talk about this critical infrastructure. The first one is that especially, but not only, political parties remain indispensable for structuring political conflicts. No cleavage, no conflict magically explains itself or suggests itself in a democracy. It takes particular institutions, to pick up a phrase from my colleague Nancy Rosenblum, it takes particular institutions to stage the battle, so to speak. And that's, of course, what traditionally political parties have done. News organizations have often followed their suggestions of how to stage the battle, but of course, some of them have sometimes themselves taken the initiative in running campaigns, trying to point at particular problems. This goes back to a question that Hege posed earlier. Personally, I think there is nothing wrong as such with partisan media, as long as everybody knows where they're coming from. And other important constraint, and this applies both to political parties and to professional news organizations, as long as they observe what you might call two hard borders or two hard constraints of democratic conflict. One, and this has come up in various conversations this afternoon, your time already, one is that there has to be a basic respect or recognition of facts. Of course, as soon as you say that, all the journalists in the audience tend to laugh and they say, facts, you think it's that easy? Of course not. And of course, as we all know, facts never speak for themselves. None of us has ever heard the facts speak. Nevertheless, there remains an imperative to hold on to a certain basic factual common ground. And then we can still have plenty of different partisan opinions around that. But if we don't do that, it's not even, when you think about it, really possible to get into any kind of democratic conflict, because the other side isn't even going to appear really as a partner in that conflict, because ultimately you have nothing in common to talk about. Second constraint, second border, and this relates a little bit to what Hege alluded to at the beginning in terms of populism. It remains a hard border that whatever you say about your adversaries in a democratic conflict, however you want to start or ignite a conflict, you cannot deny the standing of other groups or particular citizens in a democracy. In my view, and I know that not everybody agrees with this, of course, in my view, this is exactly what populists tend to do. They tend to suggest that only some people are what they often call the real people. They symbolically, but also, of course, very often practically exclude a number of citizens, or sometimes, typically already unpopular minorities, from the polity as such. And this is the other hard border of what you cannot do if you want to stage the democratic battle in a legitimate way. So that's the first function. The second function is to provide, and this has also actually come up already a little bit in Daniel Hallen's contribution, the second function remains to provide both external and less obviously internal pluralism. External pluralism is pretty obvious. Of course, we want party systems and media landscapes to be pluralistic and to offer genuine choices. Internal pluralism hasn't always been obvious, especially in the case of parties, where plenty of observers sometimes say, well, look, I mean, come on, intra-party democracy, you know, Oscar Wilde's famous observation still applies. The problem with socialism is it takes too many evenings. We all are familiar with situations where, you know, the person who can sit around the longest or drink the most beer or whatever, or who holds out until 2 a.m. is going to win the battle of intra-party democracy. All true. And yet, we've had a pretty drastic illustration of what it means not to have intra-party democracy, which is another way of saying not to have anything like a critical but still loyal internal opposition on the basis of a real debate inside a party. The specific example, no surprise, that I'm thinking of is, of course, the Republican Party under Trump, which he has effectively remade into a personality cult, such that, as you all know, it's no longer possible to be critical of Trump and yet remain a Republican in good standing. That means there's no internal check on an actor like this. So the old insight that is reflected, for instance, in the constitutionalization of intra-party democracy in the German Basic Law, that a party that is autocratic on the inside is also more likely to have authoritarian tendencies when it comes to power, I think still applies. And surely it's not an accident that many of the populist regimes we see in our day are founded or based on populist parties, which also are highly autocratic in certain ways. I think it's fair to say that this applies to Orban, this applies to Kaczynski, this applies to Erdogan, this applies to Modi, this applies to a whole range of actors. So internal pluralism, while sometimes derided as a kind of, you know, more or less superfluous decoration, remains very important. And the same is true of professional news organizations, but alas, for reasons of time, I can get into that. But if some of you want to follow up later, then please do. Swiftly moving on to the 3 criteria I wanted to put on the table. They're essentially normative criteria to put us into a better position to judge the health of political parties and professional news organizations. The first one is that these institutions have to remain accessible. This is, in a sense, another way of saying that we should resist tendencies towards cartelization, be it in party systems or be it a certain emergence of monopoly power in media landscapes. So far, so obvious. Second criterion, these institutions have to be autonomous. They cannot become the tool of more or less visible interests that are pursuing goals unrelated to the inherent aims of political parties or media organizations. Classic example is Forza Italia in Italy. Basically, it became an instrument for someone like Berlusconi to protect his business interests. And the party, in many, many ways, at least at the beginning, I think it's fair to say, wasn't really a party. And the same, I think, can be said about plenty of professional news organizations that are really basically at the will of more or less oligarchic figures. And then finally, and here I'm using a term that was first suggested by Honora O'Neill, the distinguished British philosopher, these institutions have to be accessible. I know that especially in the UK, the word assessment has sort of gotten a bad reputation because, you know, it immediately sort of conjures up nightmares of, you know, endless quantitative exercises in terms of, you know, who has done best in terms of publications in universities and so on. But the basic insight remains relevant and is not quite reducible to a somewhat related term, namely transparency. Accessibility in this case really means that citizens are in a good enough position to understand what these institutions, be it parties or be it professional news organizations, are about, who finances them, how they work internally, who calls the shots inside them, that they can basically form firm judgments of what they are about. And this goes back to the question about partisan media. As long as people can assess them properly and they understand what's going on and where such organizations are coming from, what they stand for, how they're financed, whether, you know, they sort of say one thing and do another. Fox is, you know, as usual, a great example of this. You know, they speak out against certain restrictions in the pandemic, yet they themselves, of course, basically told people to stay home, you know, be super careful and so on when it came to their employees. That sort of is a situation where people are no longer necessarily in a good position to assess these institutions. Again, I understand this is fairly abstract at this level, but I just find that the discussion of these institutions has veered from one extreme to the other, or has been informed by mistaken beliefs about a golden age that we've supposedly lost, that hasn't been very helpful. So this is just a preliminary attempt to basically give us something more useful, both by way of thinking about the functions of these institutions and by way of more or less normative criteria as to what we should really expect from them. By itself, none of this will, of course, address what troubles our democracies. I'm not saying that policy isn't important. I'm not saying that plenty of other things which have also been discussed today, such as probably most prominently civic education, isn't important. That's not the point. It's not one or the other, but this is hopefully a small and not entirely useless contribution as to how we should reflect on present-day crisis. And we actually haven't even talked about what exactly a crisis is. So if anybody would like to ask about that, that's certainly also an important thing to put back on the table. Thank you.
Thank you, Jan. And please, I ask the audience participants of this event, send me a signal if anybody has a question or comment to Jan. And maybe we can collect some, because we do not have much time, as you know. My question would be first, maybe, but we can collect some more, as I said. When you are talking about the institutional infrastructure, which is so important for democracy, there might be an argument that which is not so extreme what you started with at the beginning, but a sort of argument that these institutions are supposed to adapt to the 21st century and to the 20s of the 21st century. And maybe they are somehow old-fashioned. There is a tendency, as always after a while, that there is a growing gap between citizens and institutions which seem to be far away from everyday life. So what to do to bring citizens closer to their important infrastructure, what you are talking about? And some might argue that, for example, referenda or direct democracy, which is not just replacing representative democracy, but maybe a supplement to representative democracy, and many other new ideas. Like, TV debates were relatively new in the 60s in the United States. So somehow involving citizens, and in that sense, town hall meetings might not be hostile to representative democracies. And civil society is also a relatively new phenomenon, which also supplements political parties, but not throws them out of the picture. So what do you think, especially focusing on younger people who might be interested in social media networks and communication? Maybe they don't care much about traditional institutions. So I'm personally, I like what you say, but we are not so young anymore. So unfortunately, we might think about those who might have very different experiences and might not believe so fundamentally in old-fashioned liberal institutions. So what would be your reaction? And now I ask some other people. I see that Rafael has a question. Please, Rafael, go ahead. Try to be not very long like I was, but please be short. Thank you.
Mr. Müller, thank you for the inspiring thoughts. I didn't think it was too complex. I think your three-pillar analysis of the health of democracy is kind of very on point. My question is very specific. I'm a Polish German living in Hungary. I'm a researcher, and I'm experiencing the different stages democracy is developing in Central and Eastern Europe. So, for example, in Hungary, we have like this kind of illiberal democracy, and Poland is following the Hungarian path a bit. So if I would see your analysis, I would see the health of democracy kind of very low. And my question is, how can we proceed from here? Because in the morning, I'm not sure if you were there, Mr. Marek was referencing that the European Union is pushing too hard the liberal core of democracy, and it's kind of causing this kind of Euroscepticism, which I couldn't agree on, because I think the European Union is doing a kind of very good job with the rule of law mechanism. It's not very much developed, but it might be the first step into the right direction. And he mentioned that we could strengthen civil society, but I was a bit worried if civil society is oppressed and maybe the European Union mechanism is not reaching the civil society, what else can we do from here? What you are German as well, and you are in the United States. What might be the role of Germany? What might be the role of the US to repair this bit defect democracies?
Okay, thanks a lot. There is a third question by Andrzej Kolkai, who asks you, Jan, arguing that your description is a sort of ideal situation, and how to prevent the deterioration of this high ground. So this is the third question. I think that's enough because we are running out of time. So Jan, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Okay, so 3 points in response to Hege's question. So number one, there's a fair bit of empirical evidence that various experiments in more participation, be it referendums, be it town halls, etc., actually end up being more inegalitarian than boring old party democracy. That's not a reason not to keep trying or not to keep thinking about them and so on, but the kind of, things you hear from what unkindly one could call the democracy innovation industry often end up actually empowering those who already have more power, more resources, are more eloquent, are more educated, and so on. And there are, I think, still good reasons to believe that much more traditional and boring institutions, be it trade unions, be it traditional parties, and so on, have more egalitarian effects than some innovations. Point number one. Point number two, there remain also, in my view, so I'm not against these innovations per se. I think there are many instances where there are very strong reasons to push for them. One, of course, rather obviously, is when parties have to decide about the conditions of their own functioning. So to take a very topical example, as we've by now learned very, very clearly, it's a disaster if the German parliament has to decide about the size of the German parliament. This is the kind of thing that you may well give over to randomly chosen citizens. Same applies to questions of campaign finance, for instance, where it's very hard to say that all parties should basically decide on the conditions of their own resources and so on. Which brings me to the third point, which is that behind all these relatively abstract points I was making this evening your time, I think there's one thing that remains very relevant, and I think that always has to be in these discussions, lest we kind of sort of discuss these things on a far too abstract normative level, and that is the question of money. So if the critical infrastructure of democracy is financed in such a way that existing inequalities are entrenched or maybe even compounded, then all these nice normative criteria aren't going to do a lot of work. And of course, Europeans sometimes have a tendency to say, well, but in our part of the world, things are more or less okay. Of course, the Americans are crazy, $14 billion spent on federal elections in 2020 alone. But if you look more closely also at European systems, I'll just use one example, France. There's something wrong with the fact that you can deduct contributions to political parties from your taxes. Because when you think about it, what that means concretely is that the poor end up subsidizing the political preferences of the rich. And I can't go into details here, but there are a number of very, I think, plausible proposals to basically equalize at least some aspects of the financing of this critical infrastructure. And that would be also an important point to to go back to Hege's question, to give young people more of a sense of this is not some alien apparatus that has nothing to do with them. If you actually had resources where you had to decide, am I going to give it to this civil society organization or that political party or something along those lines, that might create a different level of, forgive the marketing language, buy-in than if all this sort of confronts you as an alien and seemingly too solid structure out there. On the second question, very briefly, and at the risk of sounding very pedantic, I thoroughly reject the term illiberal democracy as it is used by Orban and a number of observers in other parts of Europe. It's not just liberalism that is damaged in the cases that you mentioned, it's democracy itself. If you basically restrict people's basic democratic freedoms, then it's not just liberalism which suffers. Only if you believe that an election is still free and fair if the government doesn't stuff the ballot boxes on election day, could one say, yeah, liberalism is at issue, but democracy is itself fine. I think rhetorically, this is also fateful because it reinforces a particular perception that basically democracy belongs to the nation state. And then if there's a problem with, rule of law, and then we have, the language is of course also very telling. We have, mechanisms, and stuff like that. Then the sort of liberal repair sort of team comes from Brussels, led by Timmermans or somebody, and they kind of, readjust the rule of law in a very mechanical mechanism kind of way. But democracy as a living sort of thing, that is with the national people. I think this is a fatal conceptual split. And it's very helpful to the likes of Orban, Kaczynski, and others if we basically concede that, yeah, they're still doing democracy. It's just the illiberal variety. Having said that, on the more substantive issue of what can be done, so I think it's of course, as many people have said, it's on one level an entirely plausible thing to say that the European Union cannot subsidize its own adversaries. It cannot put itself in a position that is comparable to what oil means for Arab dictatorships, where you basically say, we're going to give you free resources for your kleptocracy such that you can take care of all your cronies and buy yourself support, and then in addition to that have Stop Brussels campaigns all the time. It's entirely plausible. Normatively, it's a little trickier because it would be like saying, okay, if you are, I'm not equating them, okay, but if you are a neo-Nazi, we're going to cut your unemployment benefit. We're going to sort of immediately go for resources. On one level, I think from a democratic theory point of view, that's problematic. And I know this is very unfashionable, but in a certain way, there is still something to be said for the good old Article 7, which I know, is probably never going to really be used, but the logic behind it actually is very coherent in a certain way, because it basically says we're actually not really going to intervene and we're not going to take anything away from European citizens, but we basically are going to sort of put you in to use a word that we've all had enough of, we put you in a sort of quarantine and basically say, look, we need to totally isolate this government because it's not the people that we have an issue with, and we don't really want to sort of possibly damage people's livelihoods by cutting subsidies, but the government has to be one that no longer has a say in European affairs. Now, whether that would really change anything is, of course, since it's never really been tried, a totally open empirical question. In theory, you could say, well, a government could simply say, okay, fine, then we don't, then we don't talk and decide anything in the council anymore, but we don't care, as long as we can do our thing and continue our kleptocratic stuff at home, we don't care whether, we've been denied certain membership rights or not. So I'm not saying that this is, this would be the panacea. I'm just saying that all these different strategies are obviously tricky from a normative point of view. And I think it's sometimes a more difficult issue to judge which one would really be preferable. Never mind the empirical side of what would work, but also just on the side of what is actually justified. What is certainly not justified, and forgive me if I'm starting to rant here, I'm telling you things that you already all know. What is certainly not justified, it seems to me, is the view that you also briefly brought up, namely that if the EU pushes too hard, then we're going to create yet another deeply Eurosceptic country, and it's going to be another Brexit, and so on. I mean, this has been played so many times. Orban convinced Barroso already that, you know, he couldn't do anything because, this would lead to an enormous backlash and so on. And empirically, there is no evidence for that. And normatively, basically not pushing and not being the guardian of the treaties is, of course, not neutral. If you basically are not living up to the promise of 2004, that, you know, there was not going to be any return to authoritarianism, then you basically tell all those citizens who in 2004 wanted to join the EU precisely because they took the normative promise of what the EU stands for in terms of rule of law and democracy seriously. Then you're basically telling all these citizens, sorry guys, we weren't serious. We don't care about you. You know, you're on your own. You were naive to think that you could put your faith in Europe. So I think that's important to remember, that doing nothing in these situations, or kind of going easy, or giving, or with all due respect, the Commission President giving yet another talk about, oh, but there are cultural differences between East and West, and we have to go easy on these governments here, etc., because we don't want to show any disrespect to Eastern Europe and Central Europe and so on, I think is profoundly mistaken. Anyway, as I said, I'm in real danger of ranting here and telling you things you already know. So I'll stop, and I realize I may not have answered all these questions fully, but I hope it was halfway interesting anyway.
Well, Jan, thank you very much. The problem is that we are running out of time. Otherwise, we would be glad to listen to your explanations, whether it's new or the old versions, which some of us already have heard, listening to you before or reading your articles and analyses. Anyway, we have to go on. As you know, we have a full and challenging program, and it was great to have you with us. Just stay with us if you have more time, because the next two speakers will be discussing very similar issues actually, and maybe from different perspectives. So thanks again, and we will talk sooner or later again. Now our next speaker is another old friend, Ákos Róna-Tas, who is now professor at the Sociology department at the University of California in San Diego. And the title of his presentation is Globalization, Democracy, and the Nation State. So I think it's very much connected to Jan's presentation. We just finished with the argument that democracy doesn't stop at the borders of the nation state anymore, but it's not only about the European Union as such, but I think it's true for all democracies today, more or less. I hope that, Ákos, you can hear me and you are here. So the floor is yours. Please go ahead with your presentation, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you, István, and thanks for organizing this conference. I really enjoyed the presentations I could listen to, and indeed, what I am going to talk today about has several connections to what Jan-Werner and others, like Zsolt Darvas and others, talked about. So every day, the world reminds us that in an interdependent world, we face global challenges, from pandemics to global warming, from refugee tsunamis to financial market meltdowns, from cybercrime to terrorism, from access to water to responsible use of new technologies. What these global challenges have in common is that they cannot be resolved within the boundaries of a single country, because they cannot be contained within the jurisdiction of a single nation state or even a group of nation states. Zsolt Darvas put this with elegant understatement: a major coordination problem is what's happening here. The pandemic is driving this point home with brutal force. Nation states have tried to stop the virus with public health measures of their own, overriding the desperate efforts of coordination by a toothless WHO. Yet the only success, the vaccine, emerged from one of the truly global efforts we have today, the thing we call science and technology. Although here science and technology came to our rescue, the inability of states to control and regulate scientific developments and their technological applications, from gene editing to artificial intelligence, present their own set of frightening global challenges. Global crises are problems of scale. There is a mismatch between the scale of the challenge and the scale of the state power that currently is best positioned to address it. I will argue that populist nationalism is a problem of diminished state capacity in the face of the scale of global challenges, and that this observation gives us a hint about how to move forward. The nation state itself developed to address problems of scale, and therefore its careful examination holds important clues about how to scale up to global challenges. As it emerged in the last centuries, the modern nation state created the unifying frame for national markets integrating small local economies, for national armies replacing groups of mercenaries, guard troops, and private militias, and for a national language supplanting local dialects. National culture emerged with the help of a standardized compulsory education and the promotion of national cultural production. The imagined community, much larger than anyone can experience directly, we call nation, resulted from these projects. The phenomenal success of the nation state hinged on its ability to widen and coordinate networks of social interaction by creating new institutions and a broader sense of belonging. This new form of identity stretched all the way to the borders of one's country, but not much further. Scale, well managed, brings many benefits. Larger markets allow for more specialization and thus higher productivity. Wider webs of communication facilitate more creative encounters and faster circulation of ideas. But scale also delivers something else. It allows for a system of social insurance. By spreading the risk of everyday life across a large population, be that the risk of old age, sickness, loss of job, or physical violence, people get some relief from the anxieties of modern life. A village cannot have its own flood insurance, nor can it have its own pension system or army. It is too small for that. The cost of the protection against and the mitigation of risk must be dispersed across a larger population. History has seen several attempts to scale up nationalism itself to reach beyond its own geographic borders, continuing the process nation states had begun. Imperialism and colonialism tried to expand particular nationalisms into foreign lands with disastrous results we know all too well. Well, in many ways, the Cold War provides a very interesting solution to the problem of one particular global challenge, but I don't want to talk about this. I would like to sort of move on to the last couple of decades. The fall of communism brought high hopes for the nations of Eastern Europe. Poland, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria celebrated their newly gained independence, whilst Czechoslovakia and Yugoslavia disintegrated into smaller national states. But just as these formerly communist countries began to enjoy their newly gained powers of self-determination, they quickly encountered three constraining forces from different directions. The first set of restraints were imposed by democratization through checks and balances on the executive of the state, distributing its power sideways to other national institutions. Autonomous judiciaries, presses, and opposition parties, along with others, such as chambers of commerce, trade unions, and professional organizations, claimed different pieces of the state's discretionary power. A second set of limitations arrived as many decisions moved from the national level to localities. Regions, towns, villages could now make their own decisions about local matters, from taxes, licenses, and zoning to schools, roads, and policing. Finally, global processes also began to step in, limiting the capacities of the state to act, passing powers to international players such as the World Bank, the IMF, the WTO, the Bank of International Settlements, US, NATO, and so on. The influence of the European Union became palpable much before these countries joined, as the preparation for the eventual accession required compliance with basic EU rules many years in advance. The new political elites therefore inherited weak states squeezed from three directions, hollowing out its capacities to deliver to electorates. A distinguishing feature of democracy is the allocation of state power through competitive elections. Elections are about getting hold of the capacities of the state. Political parties run on promises about what they will and won't do once they have at their disposal all levers of the state apparatus and its resources. New political elites soon found out that the means they gained by winning elections were much more meager than they expected, rendering them unable to deliver policy results their voters were expecting. This set of a vicious cycle, political cycle. Governments got elected, found an underpowered state, failed to keep promises, and disappointed the electorate. The electorate then unceremoniously threw out the governing political elites. New elites came to power to fail for essentially the same reason, and they too were sent packing at the first opportunity to bring in the next government that could not do much better either. With each election, the electorate became more and more frustrated, leading to some to lose interest in politics and others to radicalize and express their dissatisfaction with increasing ferocity. When defeated in 2002, Orban, for the first time, understood that with a diminished state, political elites will cycle in and out of power indefinitely. He concluded that the way out of this downward spiral is to restore the power of the state. When in 2010, his party won a 2/3 majority in the legislature, he grabbed the unique opportunity to launch a backward-looking project to reclaim the earlier capacities of the state from all three directions. He began to unshackle the state executive from its checks and balances by taking over the press, putting party loyalists in the judiciary, and reducing opposition parties to hapless props in the legislature. Dismantling limitations from below, he vastly curtailed the authority of local political bodies and used his party to gain influence in the remaining local decisions. And finally, to claw back power from global actors, he aggressively moved against international institutions, asserting national sovereignty, which of course meant asserting the sovereignty of the Hungarian state, or to put it even with more clarity and precision, asserting the sovereignty of the executive, that is, of Viktor Orban. Orban's decision was not just a self-serving whim of a power-crazed autocrat. It was a response to a structural contradiction between globalization that forcibly stretches and tears open the frame of the nation state, and democracy, electoral or participatory, that currently has no meaning outside the frame of a country. Not seeing this tension between globalization and democracy will doom to failure any future government that may replace authoritarian regimes and will result in a return to a statist dictatorship. The depth of this tension is reflected in the fact that it affects, albeit in different forms, even countries like the US and the UK, with much stronger states, ones that draw much more benefit from and have much more control over globalization than small Hungary. Trump's America First and Brexit respond to this same problem of popular frustration with the impotence of the nation state. But the regressive national statism is, statism is not the only solution to this problem of insufficient state. The European Union is another response, which attempts to construct a larger political unit that would be effective in dealing with this problem of scale. From this forward-looking perspective, the dilemma is this. The nation state is too weak to meet global challenges, but it is too strong to allow for alternatives to develop. Then the question one must ask, how can the nation state be recast to allow effective global institutions to emerge to avoid global disasters? To put it differently, how can we save nations from an anachronistic nation state? This is if not the fundamental question of our times. And if there were an answer that can be delivered in a 30-minute talk, we would have this question been answered long ago. But we can make a modest step forward if we realize that we can usefully distinguish between two obstacles on the way. One is popular appeal of the nation state. The other is the fight national political elites mount to keep the status quo. In the time that remains, I will address the first obstacle and will conveniently, some might say irresponsibly, ignore the second. Furthermore, I will restrict my attention to the European Union and will have nothing to say about other regional formations. Finally, I will think, while I think that regional institutions are a big and much needed step toward the final goal, I will have nothing to say how to get from a handful of regional players to collective global solutions. So how to recast the nation state? The popular appeal of the nation state is that it is a unique source of security and identity. The first appeal is physical and economic. The second is psychological and cultural. Any attempt to recast the nation state must offer an alternative on both fronts. One way of thinking about the nation is that it is a risk community, and the government is the organ that manages risk and delivers security for its nationals. The welfare state is the form in which the state most explicitly embraces its role to provide security. But since at least the 19th century, even the most minimalist states saw as their duty to defend the country from external military attacks, maintain security of property, mitigate natural disasters, and prevent deadly epidemics. Modern states now deliver insurance on a much wider scale. Being part of the nation means that one can count on these protections, even if the history of delivering them has been very uneven and complicated. Importantly, these protections in recent history have been furnished only by nation states. As long as these protections are available only from national governments and from nowhere else, nation states will remain powerful. From this, it follows that if the EU wants to successfully integrate its member countries, it must offer all or most of these protections. There has already been one important step that would have been unimaginable in an earlier era. The idea of a nation state without its own sovereign military would have struck most people in the first part of the 20th century as completely fanciful. Today, most nation states of the European Union gave up their national armies. So I just list three things that the European Union could do. Then the first and most feasible step could be an EU-wide unemployment insurance system. The second one would be an EU pension system. And the third one would be a European healthcare system. This is the most difficult and most complicated, this last one, but there are already certain steps in that direction. There's a European healthcare card. And before we sort of think big, we should pay special attention to pandemic related institutions. As COVID made it clear, a common public health authority with powers of coordination and enforcement, even if limited in infectious diseases, is urgently necessary to deal with the coronavirus, to manage this and future pandemics. One way of thinking about pandemics is that they are like wars that require the sudden mobilization of large resources that lay idle for long periods of time. Just as an army does little in peace, this force would stay alert for years to deploy on hours' notice. This pandemic force should be created, trained, and equipped by the European Union to fight pandemics. But this is just one part of the equation. The other part is identity. Identity is a self-definition via membership in a fictitious group. The group is fictitious because its members do not know each other, nor are connected. Identity is always a link to people we do not know and never met. Being a father is a position in a group of intimately related people, family. Identifying as a father describes the person not as a member of his family, but a member of a category of fathers. This group of category includes a very large number of unrelated people who nevertheless share some set of traits and experiences that they consider central to who they are. Seen from the opposite direction, identity is what enables people to develop a sense of belonging to groups too large for personal connections. Nation will remain an important source of identity, but one's identity always contains multiple layers and facets. And the European Union must develop its own, foster its own identity project. And it already started with European media and cultural events. These would have to be expanded. But one of the most successful programs building European identity is the Erasmus program that allows college students to study elsewhere in Europe. Yet this is limited to college students, and we should again take a page from the nation state. As the main tool of national identity building has been in the history of the nation states compulsory education, the next logical step would be the creation of a network of European elementary, middle, and high schools in all countries. These should exist side by side with state, religious, and private schools, but should be free of charge. Parents should be able to choose whether they want their children to go to a public school or to a private school or a religious school or a European school without financial consequences. The curriculum of these European schools should be adjusted to the host country's history and culture, but should emphasize European themes, have mandatory language requirements, and short exchange programs between schools across borders. Most importantly, European identity must have a clearer focus, a substantive focus. It originally centered on avoiding the next European war, and by now that goal has spent its emotional force. The new European identity must take on new causes, and that could start with the list of truly global challenges no nation state is able to solve on its own, the ones that we listed from climate change to economic security. To regulation of technology, but also should include social and economic security. So currently, European politics is simply the extension of national politics. And this is going back to a point Jan-Werner made. The European Parliament is created by national parties that contest in national elections for the opportunity to serve their country in Strasbourg. This is one of the reasons why European politics is conceived as far from the reach of voters. To influence decisions made in Brussels, voters must first influence national politics that they already perceive as ineffectual. The lack of popularity of Brussels is not the result of people's satisfaction with their own national polity. To the contrary, it is the consequence of their deep dissatisfaction with their national political elites. So electoral politics in Europe must become truly European. Parties must run on European issues and gather votes across national borders. That demands the clear answers why certain issues are European and why their solutions need the scale of the European Union. We need a new democratic structure, one that is not wedded to the nation state, one where voters can directly control politicians charged with making global decisions. In this new democracy, representation and participation should both find their place together with local autonomy at each level. For the European political project to work, it must promote the autonomy of the political units below the state. Local autonomy is EU's best friend. So to conclude, the world is in danger and democracy is in peril. The two risks are related. Both are connected to the obsolete form of the nation state. We must create executive institutions that can be effective above the scale of individual nations and political institutions that can democratically control them. The nation state will not go away anytime soon and will remain an important source of identity, culture, and even executive might. And this is not a bad thing. Just states should yield some of their sovereignty to larger institutions like the European Union and also to localities. Even in a world where strong supranational units manage global challenges, solutions to global problems will depend on states to implement and monitor global policies. Moreover, not all problems are global. In fact, most can and should be solved at the national or local levels without direct involvement of supranational institutions. The diversity of differences among countries also serves Europe well in many areas. Even solutions to global problems can benefit from learning from variations in national policies. The global scale of some of our immediate and most dangerous problems require a reassessment of democracy and the role of the nation state. The European Union must learn from nation states and bolster its capacity to become a principal source of security and identity of its citizens. It should also show that democracy and politics is not the exclusive realm of the nation state by fostering pan-European parties, public discourse, and hierarchical political structure with strong local autonomy and new electoral institutions. If it fails, we are facing a world of authoritarian states jockeying for the highest ground on a sinking ship. Thank you.
Thank you, Ákos, and it's great how you combined your starting theoretical approach with very practical recommendations, actually, at the end of your speech, how the EU might change itself, how it can be more effective, more visionary, more efficient, actually. Many would argue that number one issue is that politicians and in that sense, European politicians should also deliver something to the people, but you actually emphasize many other aspects like identity, scale, the relationship between nation state, the member state level, if you want, and the supranational level. So a sort of vision, what we really need to discuss the future of the European Union as a political entity. So I think it was very helpful, and now we have very limited time to have some questions and comments, although I would like to raise the question whether Andrew Arato is with us. I cannot see András actually amongst the participants, but maybe he is under a different name, and I hope that he will join us, and he knows exactly the same Zoom link as we all use. But so let's continue a little bit, and hopefully András is joining us sooner or later. So let's start with any comments or questions. I just checked the chat box, and it's again András Kolkai who mentioned that when we talked about the European public sphere a couple of years ago, there was not much echo in the room. Only some specialists believe that that might come to reality. And also, I might add that some years ago, European elections were seen only as second-order elections, which actually somehow were reactions to national elections. As Ákos also mentioned, that even today we do not have trans-European parties. And in many sense, these are national elections in a reverse way, but these elections have become more and more Europeanized. The topics, the issues are much more interconnected to other member states and to the European issues. Just to mention Hungary, Hungary has become in a way a forerunner of Europeanizing our domestic politics in a very strange paradox ways, creating scandals at European level. But it happened to many other member states, and I think we have a different structure now regarding party politics and European elections and the European public sphere and all the stuff Ákos talked about. Now let me check whether anybody has a comment and question. Is anybody who would like to send me a message or a signal that he or she would like to make a comment on Ákos' speech at the moment? It was a long day for many of us.
Zsuzsa.
I know.
Zsuzsa, yes.
Zsuzsa, you can see Zsuzsa. Okay, Zsuzsa, go ahead. I cannot see you. Yes, now I see your hand. Zsuzsa, the floor is yours.
Okay, well, thank you very much. It's I was listening with great interest both Jan-Werner Müller and Ákos Róna-Tas' contributions, and of course, what you were speaking about, those seems to be very different from each other. From like a Hungarian political perspective, it's very much linking to each other. It's all about how to, well, it's called a revitalize or revive real democracy, and how in order that we can also survive in a global scale. So it's very, very much the same issues. And you are talking about things that, as a Hungarian politician, I've been thinking with many colleagues in the last 10 years, because obviously we are in the forefront of struggling with all these problems, including what the EU did and not did for its Hungarian citizens who actually wanted to be Europeans and live like Europeans, and the questions you discuss, including the media, all this super interesting functions and criteria of critical institutions. These are the very basic things that we've been struggling in the last years. And of course, what Ákos told in more details about what at EU level we should do in order to make this organization able to cope with the global reality is absolutely a linking question. Also our local issues in Hungary. So my question to both of you is about agency. Of course, as a politician, I also always think about what can be done, and I think it's super important that in your work you try to figure out theoretical framework, how to renew the discourse and try to profile the structures of what to do. And while at some point in the previous round already questioned that who would then be the responsible actors to make it happen. And this is also my question, so but a bit more concrete. So there are too many stakes in this big game at national level and political parties level. And while this sounds super common sense and meaningful, what you are saying, still there are very weak forces which are actually supporting this. As István said, the trans-European parties are absolutely minimal. However, there is now 1% of Europeans who do not live in the country where they were born and raised. So that's already a meaningful, it's millions of people who live now in other countries. There are no European parties. We started, or the EU started, an electoral reform, which then failed 5 years later. So it's actually 2019, it was a backlash compared to 2014. So there are many things which were happening, and still we are not so much more ahead. There is plenty of initiatives to create a European media space, which is nowhere, it's not at all happening, even though there are so many new technologies that would make it possible. So who are your allies? That's basically my question, because there's plenty of fantastic, I mean, we do understand quite a lot of things now, and who are the allies of academia? Because definitely the political forces are not the ones who would push this reform through.
Yeah, Ákos, it's your turn. Just to add to Zsuzsa, it may be allies of academia, think tanks, and NGOs, since we, as Hungarian Europe Society, we are somewhere in between a think tank and an NGO, not really an academic institution. So who are our allies? Just following Zsuzsa's question. Ákos, the floor is yours.
So I won't be able to say, to tell you who the allies are. What I see is that as long as, so if these institutions that I give 3 of these sort of social security programs, if these become part of people's lives, if they can choose between, say, a European pension and a Hungarian pension, I go further. If they can choose between a European school for the kids or an Hungarian or a Polish school, then politics become alive for people, and the public discourse becomes amenable to political mobilization, to pan-European parties, to pan-European political discourse. As long as nothing is sort of directly European that people experience in their everyday lives, but Europe is sort of this one step removed thing, which is sort of just above the corrupt or sort of ineffectual national politics, there is nothing is going to happen. Just having European news is useless unless people actually have a stake in the news items. The way that you give stake to them is for the European Union to directly influence their everyday lives. And one way of doing this is to offer them a better alternative in terms of security than nation states do. So yeah, this is not a political science answer. This is sort of a sociological answer. I will leave sort of the political problem to others because it is the main problem, and it is an intractable problem at this moment. But I think the first step to do is to sort of try to pass a European-wide unemployment insurance system, and I think that would sort of make sort of the first step and could create a precedent and could create a mechanism that would show that, you know, this is possible, as well as I would like to have a European school system that could just start with a few schools in each country, and then, you know, it could sort of increase in numbers, and people could choose. They could decide whether they would want to put their kids in the state school or and I think at that point, people would get. Now, the last thing I want to say, and this is a part that I skipped in my presentation, most of these global challenges have a very, very short time frame. We have to make big steps in the next few years on climate change, on technology, on pandemics. All of these things have a very, very short time frame, and that sort of creates an additional problem, because building identity, building identification, building political legitimacy happens usually over decades.
Well, thank you, Ákos. I'm just asking Andrew Ereto whether he is on board or not. I sent him a message, an email, but I think he is not here. So we might still wait a little bit for him, because he has lectures in the early morning. That's what he wrote to me. So maybe he would show up. But since we are waiting a little bit, I would like to ask you, Ákos, actually about the topic I have originally asked András to speak about. Since you mentioned so many times the issue of identity and identity building. Now, identity is used in politics, not especially for European identity, but now we talk about minority rights, sexual identity, all sorts of new identities we have, not only in the United States, but maybe this all comes from your country, and especially in California. This is a hot and sensitive political issue which divides the political spectrum and the people. And it's a huge issue on the left, on the progressive side of the political spectrum in the US, but also on the right. And this culture war, what we see is coming towards Europe, and it's present here in Hungary as well, in a way misused by the current government, giving a spin, a radical ultra-conservative spin to these debates, which are probably much more democratic, although sometimes very strange debates, looking at them from a Central European perspective. So I would like to ask you about the future of liberal democracy when we face these new old and new identities which might somehow structure political debates and create even more political polarization, which might be bad for the future of liberal democracy, but might be necessary steps to make it clear who are we, who belongs to whom, what is our identity. So, Ákos, could you make please a short comment or a longer comment on this very complicated but fashionable topic?
Okay, so you are absolutely right that we have sort of a proliferation of identities, and these some of them are very polarizing, others are not so much. But you know, one way of summarizing, say, American politics is that it is a politics which is very partisan, with very weak parties, very strong party identification, at the same time very weak political parties and political structures. And this is a general problem that identities often sort of mitigate against sort of bureaucracies. It is really hard so political parties are supposed to channel political conflicts and rationalize them and sort of repackage them and fight them in political ways. But for that, you need to have an organization, a party organization. You need to have a party elite. You need to have this party elite needs to have resources that allows them to sort of control who gets to speak, who gets to run for office, who gets further in the party. If you look at the United States, what you find is that both parties are now in a major way influenced by people who are not part of the party elite, who are not part of the party. The Republicans are now completely taken over by Trump, who was not even a Republican until recently. And the Democrats are very strongly under the pressure of Bernie Sanders, who is not a Democrat, he is an independent. So, but you see that also in Europe, that party systems are sort of disintegrating. Brexit is another sign of the disintegration of party systems. The whole issue had to be forced outside the party system into a referendum, and basically the parties were just completely helpless. You see the same thing in France, where within 6 months, Macron was able to create his own party and sort of upend the entire French party system. You see, Germany is probably the last part where sort of the party system is still working, but today's elections show that the main parties are losing ground, and the parties that are coming up are the smaller parties. And I would be surprised if there were a government within the next week or a month even, because of the complications of the results. So party politics is in crisis. To a large extent, it is crisis because of identity politics and politics as identity, and it needs to be reinvented. And I don't have any sort of great idea how to do that, but it is clear that even in Hungary, we don't have parties. I mean, even in Hungary, Fidesz is not a party. Fidesz is Viktor Orban commanding the state. And then what we have as parties are those opposition creations who desperately try to act as parties, but they are playing in a world where parties are weak. And so I don't know how to help this, but we have to realize and understand that we have to rethink party politics as well, not just the nation state.
Okay, thank you, Ákos, for your comment and jumping in to respond this issue. I just asked last time for one more occasion whether Andrew Arato András is with us, but I think he won't join us because it's quite late now, and he knew that he should come, and he did not, so maybe he was not able to join us. So what I would like to do is just to say 2-3 sentences, because it's really late. Many of us started relatively early before lunch in Central European time, so it's a long day, and many of us are relatively tired, and I do not want to make another speech again. Just would say that this was a project, and this was a concluding conference we now had on transatlantic relations. We gave the title to this webinar series and this final conference, Uncertain Times, and I think we succeeded in a way to show that issues we have discussed are very similar problems all over on both sides of the Atlantic, just like the last one about political parties. When talking about Fidesz or talking about the Republican Party, well, assumingly two countries relatively far away from each other with very different culture, path dependency, and history, but somehow in the 21st century we face very similar problems, certainly different scale and maybe different issues regarding racism, for example. But even in the case of racism, sometimes something is coming from the US, and Hungary reacts, Hungarian elites react, ordinary people react to new problems and create new cleavages amongst themselves, and that polarize societies. So we live in a new era when we are not closed societies anymore, and we live in an era when we are more than 30 years after the regime changes in our region, and more than 17 years, if I'm correct, joining the European Union, but still we have very new sort of common problems with the Western part of Europe. Populism and illiberalism, what we discussed so deeply today, is not only a Hungarian and Polish phenomena, but somehow resembles some problems in France, what was just mentioned, and many other issues which are similar everywhere. Just a couple of years ago, migration was not an issue in Hungary, and 2 years ago, 5 years ago, that was the #1 political dilemma Hungary seemed to face, at least in the eyes of our citizens. So we have very interesting times, and Hungary faces elections, and I talked about it at the very beginning with an optimistic tone, and I would like to close this final remarks with this optimism that history can be changed, the future is unknown, and not everything is given. There is nothing like historic or cultural determinism. We, as Ákos would agree, we have certainly a path dependency, but it means that we have many different choices, not only for Hungary, but for the European Union and the other side of the Atlantic too. So we should, I think, look at the 20s of the 21st century with some sort of optimism when we are out of this COVID-19 crisis and pandemic, and hopefully this transatlantic relations we talked a lot about will be in a better shape in a couple of years, and in general the world will be in a better shape. So with this optimistic remark, I would like to close our conference and our webinar series, and I would like to thank everybody who is still with us. I know that some people had to leave. It's really late evening in Central Europe, and thank you for coming. Thank you for all the presenters and speakers, and for the questions, and thanks for our sponsors, and thanks to all of you, and hope to see you soon again at another maybe Zoom or maybe in situ event, as we call it. See you soon, and thanks for everybody who participated in this project, and bye-bye, and see you. Bye. Thank you.